Hello and welcome back to Baby Elias's Stories. We now return to The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 29. They was fetching a very nice-looking old gentleman along, and a nice-looking younger one with his right arm in a sling. And my souls, how the people yelled and laughed and kept it up. But I didn't see no joke about it, and I judged it would strain the Duke and the King some to see Annie. I reckoned they'd a turned pale, but no, nary a pale did they turn. The Duke, he never let on he suspicioned what was up, but just went a goo-gooing around, happy and satisfied, like a jug that's googling out buttermilk. As for the King, he just gazed and gazed down sorrowful on them newcomers like it give him the stomach ache in his very heart to think there could be such frauds and rascals in the world. Oh, he done it admirable. Lots of the principal people gathered around the King to let him see they was on his side. That old gentleman that had just come looked all puzzled to death. Pretty soon he begun to speak, and I see straight off he pronounced like an Englishman, not the King's way, though the King's was pretty good for an imitation. I can't give the old gent's words, no, I can't imitate him, but he turned around to the crowd and says about like this. This is a surprise to me which I wasn't looking for. And I'll acknowledge, candid and frank, I ain't very well fixed to meet it and answer it, for my brother and me has had misfortunes. He's broke his arm, and our baggage got put off at a town above here last night in the night by a mistake. I am Peter Wilkes' brother Harvey, and this is brother William, which can't hear nor speak, and can't even make signs to amount to much. Now't he's only got one hand to work them with. We are who we say we are, and in a day or two, when I get the baggage, I can prove it. But up till then, I won't say nothing more, but go to the hotel and wait. So him and the new dummy started off, and the King he laughs and blethers out. Broke his arm, very likely, ain't it, and very convenient, too. For a fraud that's got to make signs and hain't learn how. Lost their baggage. That's mighty good and mighty ingenious under the circumstances. So he laughed again, and so did everybody else, except 3 or 4, maybe half a dozen. One of these was that doctor, and another one was a sharp-looking gentleman with a carpet bag of the old-fashioned kind made out of carpet stuff that had just come off the steamboat and was talking to him in a low voice and glancing towards the King now and then and nodding their heads. It was Levy Bell, the lawyer that was gone up to Louisville. And another one was a big, rough husky that come along and listened to all the gentlemen said, and was listening to the King now. And when the King got done, this husky up and says, Say, looky here, if you are Harvey Wilkes, when'd you come to this town? The day before the funeral, friend, says the King. But what time of day? In the evening, about an hour or 2 before sundown. How'd you come? I come down on the Susan Powell from Cincinnati. Well then, how'd you come to be up at the Pint in the morning in a canoe? I warn't up at the Pint. It's a lie. Several of them jumped for him and begged him not to talk that way to an old man and a preacher. Preacher be hanged. He's a fraud and a liar. He was up at the Pint that morning. I lived up there, don't I? Well, I was up there, and he was up there. I see him there. He come in a canoe, along with Tim Collins and a boy. The doctor, he up and says, Would you know the boy again if you was to see him, Hines? I reckon I would, but I don't know. Why, yonder he is now. I know him perfectly easy. It was me he pointed at. The doctor says, Neighbors, I don't know whether the new couple is frauds or not, but if these two ain't frauds, I am an idiot, that's all. I think it's our duty to see that they don't get away from here till we've looked into this thing. Come along, Hines. Come along, the rest of you. We'll take these fellas to the tavern and affront them with the other couple, and I reckon we'll find out something before we get through. It was nuts for the crowd, though maybe not for the king's friends, so we all started. It was about sundown. The doctor, he led me along by the hand and was plenty kind enough, but he never let go my hand. We all got in a big room in the hotel and lit up some candles and fetched in the new couple. First the doctor says, I don't wish to be too hard on these two men, but I think they're frauds, and they may have accomplices that we don't know nothing about. If they have, won't the accomplices get away with that bag of gold Peter Wilkes left? It ain't unlikely. If these men ain't frauds, they won't object to sending for that money and letting us keep it till they prove they're all right. Ain't that so? Everybody agreed to that. So I judged they had our gang in a pretty tight place, right at the outstart. But the king, he only looked sorrowful and says, Gentlemen, I wish the money was here. I wish the money was there, for I ain't got no disposition to throw anything in the way of a fair, open, out-and-out investigation of this miserable business. But alas, the money ain't there. You can send and see if you want to. Where is it then? Well, when my niece give it to me to keep for her, I took and hid it inside the straw, tick on my bed, not wishing to bank it for the few days we'd been here. And considering the bed a safe place, we not being used to niggers, and supposing them's honest like servants in England. The niggers stole it the very next morning after I had went downstairs. And when I sold them, I hadn't missed the money yet, so they got clean away with it. My servant here can tell you about it, gentlemen. The doctor and several said, Shucks. And I see nobody didn't altogether believe him. One man asked me if I see the niggers steal it. I said no, but I see them sneaking out of the room and hustling away, and I never thought nothing. Only I reckon they was afraid they had waked up my master and was trying to get away before he made trouble with them. That was all they asked me. Then the doctor whirls on me and says, Are you English too? I says yes, and him and some others laughed and said, Stuff. Well, then they sailed in on the general investigation, and there we had it. Up and down, hour in, hour out, and nobody never said a word about supper, nor even seemed to think about it. So they kept it up and kept it up. It was the worst mix-up thing you ever see. They made the king tell his yarn, then they made the old gentleman tell his, and everybody but a lot of prejudiced chuckleheads would have seen that the old gentleman was spinning truth and the other one lies. And by they had me up to tell what I knowed. The king, he give me a left-handed look out the corner of his eye, so I knowed enough to talk on the right side. I begun to tell about Sheffield, and how we lived there, and all about the English Wilkeses, and so on. But I didn't get pretty far till the doctor begun to laugh, and Levy Bell, the lawyer, says, Sit down, my boy. I wouldn't strain myself if I was you. I reckon you ain't used to lying. It don't seem to come handy. What you want is practice. You do it pretty awkward. I don't care nothing for the compliment, but I was glad to be let off anyway. The doctor, he started to say something and turns and says, If you'd been in town at first, Levy Bell. The king broke in and reached out his hand and says, Why, this is my poor dead brother's old friend that he's wrote so often about. The lawyer and him shook hands, and the lawyer smiled and looked pleased, and they talked right along a while and then got to one side and talked low, and at last the lawyer speaks up and says, That'll fix it. I'll take the order and send it along with your brothers, and then they'll know it's all right. So they got some paper and pen, and the king he sat down and twisted his head to one side and chawed his tongue and scrawled off something. And then they gave the pen to the duke, and then for the first time the duke looked sick, but he took the pen and wrote. So then the lawyer turns to the new old gentleman and says, You and your brother, please write a line or two and sign your names. The old gentleman wrote, but nobody could read it. The lawyer looked powerful astonished and says, Well, it beats me, and snaked a lot of old letters out of his pocket and examined them, and then examined the old man's writing, and then them again, and then says, These old letters is from Harvey Wilkes, and here's these two handwritings, and anybody can see they didn't write them. The king and the duke looked sold and foolish, I tell you, to see how the lawyer had took them in. And here's this old gentleman's writing, and here's this old gentleman's handwriting, and anybody can tell, easy enough, he didn't write them. Fact is, the scratches he makes ain't properly writing at all. Now here's some letters from... The new old gentleman says, If you please, let me explain. Nobody can read my hand but my brother there, so he copies for me. It's his hand you've got there, not mine. Well, says the lawyer, this is a state of things. I've got some of William's letters too, so if you'll get him to write a line or so we can come... He can't write with his left hand, says the old gentleman. If he could use his right hand, you would see that he wrote his own letters, and mine too. Look at both, please. They're by the same hand. The lawyer done it and says, I believe it's so, and if it ain't so, there's a heap stronger resemblance than I'd noticed before anyway. Well. I thought we was right on the track of a solution, but it's gone to grass partly. But anyway, one thing is proved. These two ain't either of them Wilkeses. And he wagged his head towards the king and the duke. Well, what do you think? The mule-headed old fool wouldn't give in then. Indeed he wouldn't. Said it warn't no fair test. Said his brother William was the cossedest joker in the world, and he hadn't tried to write. He see William was going to play one of his jokes the minute he put the pen to paper. So he warmed up and went wobbling right along till he was actually beginning to believe what he was saying. Till he was actually beginning to believe what he was saying himself. But pretty soon the new old gentleman broke in and says, I've thought of something. Is there anybody here that helped to lay out the late Peter Wilkes for burying? Yes, says somebody. Me and Ab Turner done it. We're both here. Then the old man turns toward the king and says, Perhaps this gentleman can tell me what was tattooed on his breast? Blamed if the king didn't have to brace up mighty quick, or he'd have squashed down like a bluff bank that the river had cut down. Blamed if the king didn't have to brace up mighty quick, or he'd have squashed down like a bluff bank that the river has cut under. It took him so sudden, and mind you, it was a thing that was calculated to make most anybody squish to get fetched such a solid one as that without any notice, because how was he going to know what was tattooed on the man? He whitened a little. He couldn't help it, and it was mighty still in there, and everybody bending a little forwards and gazing at him. So says I to myself, now he'll throw up the sponge. There ain't no more use. Well, did he? A body can't hardly believe it, but he didn't. I reckon he thought he'd keep the thing up till he tired them people out, so they'd thin out, and him and the Duke could break loose and get away. Anyway, he sat there, and pretty soon he begun to smile and says, "Oof. It's a very tough question, ain't it? Yes, sir, I can tell you what's tattooed on his breast. It's just a small, thin blue arrow. That's what it is. And if you don't look close, you can't see it. Now what do you say, hey?" Well, I never see anything like that old blister for clean out and out cheek. The new old gentleman turns brisk towards Ab Turner and his pod, and his eye lights up like he judged he'd got the king this time and says, "There, you've heard what he said. Was there any such mark on Peter Wilkes' breast?" Both of them spoke up and says, "We didn't see no such mark." "Good," says the old gentleman. "Now what you did see on his breast was a small dim P and a B, which is an initial he dropped when he was young, and a W with dashes between them. So P-B-W. And he marked them that way on a piece of paper. Come, ain't that what you saw?" Both of them spoke up again and says, "No, we didn't. We never seen any marks at all." Well, everybody was in a state of mind now. They sings out, "The whole billing of 'em's frauds. Let's duck 'em. Let's drown 'em. Let's ride 'em on a rail." And everybody's whooping at once, and there was a rattling powwow. But the lawyer, he jumps on the table and yells and says, "Gentlemen, hear me, just a word. Just a single word, if you please. There's one way yet. Let's go and dig up the corpse and look." That took 'em. "Hooray!" they all shouted, and was starting right off. But the lawyer and the doctor sung out, hold on. Call all these 4 men and the boy, and fetch them along too." "We'll do it," they all shouted, "and if we don't find them marks, we'll lynch the whole gang." I was scared now, I tell you, but there weren't no getting away, you know. They gripped us all and marched us right along straight for the graveyard, which was 1.5 miles down the river, and the whole town at our heels, for we made noise enough, and it was only 9 in the evening. As we went by a house, I wish I hadn't sent Mary Jane out of town, because now if I could tip her the wink, she'd light out and save me and blow on our dead beats. Well, we swarmed along down the road river, just carrying on like wildcats, and to make it more scary, the sky was darkening up, and the lightning beginning to wink and flitter, and the wind to shiver amongst the leaves. This was the most awful trouble and most dangersome I ever was in, and I was kinda stunned. Everything was going so different from what I had allowed for, instead of being fixed so I could take my own time if I wanted to and see all the fun and have Mary Jane at my back to save me and set me free when the close fit come. Here was nothing in the world betwixt me and sudden death but just them tattoo marks, and if they didn't find them, I couldn't bear to think about it, and yet somehow I couldn't think about anything else. I couldn't think about nothing else. It got darker and darker, and it was a beautiful time to give the crowd the slip. But that big husky had me by the wrist, Hines, and a body might as well try to give Goliath the slip. He dragged me right along. He was so excited, I had to run to keep up. When they got there, they swarmed into the graveyard and washed over it like an overflow. And when they got to the grave, they found they had about 100 times as many shovels as they wanted, but nobody hadn't thought to fetch a lantern. But they sailed into digging anyway by the flicker of the lightning and sent a man to the nearest house 1/2 of a mile. and sent the man to the nearest house a half a mile off to borrow one. So they dug and dug like everything, and it got awful dark. And the rain started, and the wind swished and swushed along, and the lightning come brisker and brisker, and the thunder boomed, but them people never took no notice of it. They were so full of this business, and 1 minute you could see everything and every face in that big crowd, and the shovelfuls of dirt sailing up out of the grave, and the next second the dark whipped it all out, and you couldn't see nothing at all. At last they got out the coffin and begun to unscrew the lid. And then such another crowding and shouldering and shoving as there was to scrooge in. Oh, Lord.
Scrouge.
And then such another crowding and shouldering and shoving as there was to scrouge in and get a sight you never see. And in the dark that way it was awful. Hines, he hurt my wrist dreadful, pulling and tugging so, and I reckon he clean forgot I was in the world. He was so excited and panting. All of a sudden, the lightning let go a perfect sluice of white glare, and somebody sings out, "By the living jingo, here's the bag of gold on his breast." Hines let out a whoop like everyone else, and dropped my wrist and give a big surge to bust his way in and get a look. And the way I lit out and shined and shined for the road in the dark, that ain't nobody can tell. I had the road all to myself, and I fairly flew leastways. I had it all to myself, except the solid dark, and the now and then glares, and the buzzing of the rain, and the thrashing of the wind, and the splitting of the thunder, and sure as you are born, I did clip it along. When I struck the town, I see there warn't nobody out in the storm, so I never hunted for no back streets, but humped it straight through the main one. And when I begun to get towards our house, I aimed my eye and set it. No light there, the house all dark, which made me feel sorry and disappointed. I don't know why. But at last, just as I was sailing by, flash comes the light in Mary Jane's window. And my heart swelled up sudden, like to bust. And the same second the house and all was behind me in the dark, and wasn't ever going to be before me no more in this world. She was the best girl I ever see, and had the most sand. The minute I was far enough above the town to see, I could make the towhead. I begun to look sharp for a boat to borrow, and the first time the lightning showed me one that wasn't chained, I snatched it and shoved. It was a canoe and weren't fastened with nothing but a rope. The towhead was a rattling big distance off. The towhead was a rattling big distance off. Away out there in the middle of the river, but I didn't lose no time, and when I struck the raft at last, I was so fagged I would have just laid down to blow and gasp if I could afforded it, but I did it. As I sprung aboard, I sung out, "Out with you, Jim, and set her loose. Glory be to goodness, we're shut off them." Jim lit out and was a-coming for me with both arms spread. He was so full of joy, but when I glimpsed him in the lightning, my heart shut up in my mouth, and I went overboard backwards, for I forgot he was old King Lear and a drowned Arab all in one, and it most scared the livers and lights out of me. But Jim fished me out and was going to hug me and bless me and so on. He was so glad I was back, and we were shut off the king and the duke. But I says, "Not now. Have it for breakfast. Have it for breakfast. Cut loose and let us slide." So in 2 seconds, away we went, a-sliding down the river, and it did seem so good to be free again and all by ourselves on the big river and nobody to bother us. I had to skip around a bit and jump up and crack my heels a few times. I couldn't help it. But about the third crack, I noticed a sound that I knowed mighty well, and held my breath and listened and waited. And sure enough, when the next flash busted out over the water, here they come, and was just a-laying to their oars and making their skiff hum. It was the king and the duke. So I welted right down onto the planks, then give up, and it was all I could do to keep from crying. Chapter 30. When they got aboard, the king went for me and shook me by the collar and says, "Trying to give us the slip, was ye, you pup? Tired of our company, eh?" I says, "No, your majesty, we weren't. Please don't, your majesty." "Quick then, and tell us what was your idea, or I'll shake the insides out of you." "Honest, I'll tell you everything, just as it happened, your majesty. The man that had a hold of me was very good to me and kept saying he had a boy about as big as me that died last year, and he was sorry to see a boy in such a dangerous fix. And when they was all took by surprise by finding the gold and made a rush for the coffin, he let me go. He lets go of me and whispers, 'Heel it now, or they'll hang you sure.' And I let out. I didn't seem no good for me to stay. It didn't seem no good for me to stay. I couldn't do nothing, and I didn't want to be hung if I could get away. So I never stopped running till I found the canoe, and when I got there, I told Jim to hurry, or they'd catch me and hang me yet. And I said I was afeared you and the Duke wasn't alive now, and I was awful sorry, and so was Jim, and was awful glad when we see you coming. You may ask Jim if I didn't." Jim said it was so, and the king told him to shut up, and said, "Oh yes, it's mighty likely," and shook me up again, and said he reckoned he'd drown me, but the Duke says, "Let go of the boy, you old idiot. Would you have done any different? Did you inquire round for him when you got loose? I don't remember it." So the king let go of me and begun to cuss that town and everybody in it, but the Duke says, "You better a blame sight give yourself a good cussing, for you're the one that's entitled to it most. You hain't done a thing from the start that had any sense in it, except coming out so cool and cheeky with that imaginary blue arrow mark. That was bright. It was right down bully, and it was the thing that saved us. For if it hadn't been for that, they'd have jailed us till them Englishmen's baggage come, and then the penitentiary, you bet. But that trick took 'em to the graveyard, and the gold done us a still bigger kindness, for if the excited fools hadn't let go all the holts and made that rush to get a look, we'd have slept in our cravats tonight. Cravats warranted to wear too longer than we need them." There was still a minute thinking. Then the king says, kind of absent-minded like, "Humph! And we reckon the niggers stole it." That made me squirm. "Yes," says the Duke, kind of slow and deliberate and sarcastic. "We did." After about a half a minute, the king draws out, "Leastways, I did." The Duke says the same way, On the contrary, I did." The king kind of ruffles up and says, "Look here, Bilgewater, what are you referring to?" The Duke says, pretty brisk, "When it comes to that, maybe you'll let me ask, what was you referring to?" "Shucks," says the king, very sarcastic, "but I don't know. Maybe you was asleep and didn't know what you was about." The Duke bristles right up now and says, "Oh, let up on this cussed nonsense. Do you take me for a blame fool? Don't you reckon I know who hid that money in that coffin?" "Yes, sir, I know you do know because you done it yourself." "That's a lie." And the Duke went for him. The king sings out, "Take your hands off. Let go of my throat. I take it all back." The Duke says, "Well, you just own up first that you did hide that money there, intending to give me the slip one of these days, and come back and dig it up and have it all to yourself." "Wait just a minute, Duke. Answer me this one question, honest and fair. If you didn't put that money there, say it, and I'll believe you and take back everything I said." "You old scoundrel, I didn't, and you know I didn't. There now." "Well then, I believe you, but answer me only just this one more. Now don't get mad. Didn't you have it in your mind to hook the money and hide it? The Duke never said nothing for a little bit. Then he says, well, I don't care if I did. I didn't do it anyway. But you not only had it in mind to do it, but you done it. I wish I may never die if I done it, Duke. And that's honest. I won't say I weren't going to do it. I won't say I weren't going to do it, because I was. But somebody got in ahead of me. That's a lie. You done it, and you got to say you done it all. The king began to gurgle, and then he gasps out, "Nuff! I own up." I was very glad to hear him say that. It made me feel much more easier than what I was feeling before. So the Duke took his hands off and says, "If you ever deny it again, I'll drown you. It's well for you to sit there and blubber like a baby. It's fitting for you. After the way you've acted, I never seen such an old ostrich for wanting to gobble everything. And I a trusting you all the time, like you was my own father. You ought to be ashamed of yourself to stand by and hear it saddled onto a lot of poor niggers, and you never say a word for them. It makes me feel ridiculous to think I was soft enough to believe that rubbish. Cuss you! Cuss you! I can see now why you were so anxious to make up the deficit. You wanted to get what money I'd got out of the nonsuch, and one thing or another, and scoop it all. The king says, timid and still a snuffling, "Why, Duke, it was you that said make up the deficit. It weren't me. Dry up. Dry up. I don't want to hear no more out of you," says the Duke. "And now you see what you got by it. They've got all their own money back, and all of ourn but a shekel or two besides. Go long to bed, and don't you deficit me no more deficits, long's you live." So the king sneaked into the wigwam and took to his bottle for comfort, and before long the Duke tackled his bottle, and so in about a half an hour they was as thick as thieves again, and the tighter they got, the lovinger they got, and went off a snoring in each other's arms. They both got powerful mellow, but I noticed the king didn't get mellow enough to forget to remember to not deny about hiding the money bag again. That made me feel easy and satisfied. Of course, when they got to snoring, we had a long gabble, and I told Jim everything. Chapter 31. We dasn't stop again at any town for days and days. Kept right along down the river. We was down south in the warm weather now, and a mighty long ways from home. We begun to come to trees with Spanish moss on them, hanging down from the limbs like long gray beards. It was the first I ever seen it growing, and it made the woods look solemn and dismal. So now the frauds reckoned they was out of danger, and they begun to work the villages again. First, they done a lecture on temperance, but they didn't make enough for them to both get drunk on. Then in another village, they started a dancing school, but they didn't know no more how to dance than a kangaroo does. So the first prance they made, the general public jumped in and pranced them out of town. Another time they tried a go at yellow auction, but they couldn't yellow cute long till the audience got up and give them a solid good cussing and made them skip out. They tackled missionarying and mesmerizing and doctoring and telling fortunes and little of everything, but they couldn't seem to have no luck. So at last they got just about dead broke and laid around the raft as she floated along, thinking and never saying nothing. by the half a day at a time, a dreadful blue and desperate. And at last they took a change and begun to lay their heads together in the wigwam and talk low and confidential 2 or 3 hours at a time. Jim and me got uneasy. We didn't like the look of it. We judged they was studying up some kind of worse deviltry than ever. We turned it over and over, and at last we made up our minds they was going to break into somebody's house or store, or was going into the counterfeit money business or something. So then we was pretty scared, and made up an agreement that we wouldn't have nothing in the world to do with such actions, and if we ever got the least show, we would give them the cold shake and clear out and leave them behind. Well, early one morning, we hid the raft in a good safe place about 2 miles below a little bit of a shabby village named Pikesville. And the king, he went ashore and told us all to stay hid whilst he went up to town and smelt around to see if anybody had got any wind of the royal Nonsuch there yet. House to rob, you mean? Says I to myself. And when you get through robbing it, you'll come back here and wonder what's become of me and Jim in the raft, and you'll have to take it out in wondering. And he said if he weren't back by midday, the Duke and me would know it was all right, and we was to come along. So we stayed where we was. The Duke, he fretted and sweated around and was in a mighty sour way. He scolded us for everything, and we couldn't seem to do nothing right, for he found fault with every little thing. Something was a brewing, sure. I was good and glad when midday come and no king. We could have a change anyway, and maybe a chance for the change on top of it. So me and the Duke went up to the village and hunted around there for the king. And by we found him in the back room of a little low dodgery, very tight, and a lot of loafers bully-ragging him for sport. And he a-cussing and threatening with all his might, and so tight he couldn't walk and couldn't do nothing to them. The Duke, he begun to abuse him for an old fool, and the king begun to sass back. And the minute they was fairly at it, I lit out and shook the reefs out of my hind legs and spun down the river road like a deer, for I see a chance. And I made up my mind that it would be a long day before they ever see me and Jim again. I got down there all out of breath, but loaded up with joy and sung out, "Set it loose, Jim. We're all right now." But there warn't no answer, and nobody come out of the wigwam. Jim was gone. I set up a shout, and then another one, and run this way and that in the woods, whooping and screeching, but it warn't no use. Old Jim was gone. Then I sat down and cried. I couldn't help it, but I couldn't set still long. Pretty soon I went out on the road trying to think what I better do, and I run across a boy walking, and asked him if he'd seen a strange nigger dressed so-and-so, and he says, "Yes." "Whereabouts?" I says. "Down to Silas Phelps' place, 2 miles below here. He's a runaway nigger, and they've got him. Was you looking for him?" "You bet I ain't. I run across him in the woods about an hour or 2 ago, and he said if I hollered, he'd cut my livers out and told me to lay down and stay where I was, and I done it, but been there ever since, afeard to come out." "Well," he says, "you needn't be afeard no more, because they've got him. He run from down south somewheres. It's a good job they got him. Well, I reckon there's $200 reward on him. It's like picking up money out in the road." "Yes, it is, and I could have had it if I'd been big enough. I see him first." "Who nailed him?" "It was an old fellow, a stranger, and he sold out his chance in him for $40 because he got to go up the river and can't walk. Think of that now. You bet I'd wait if it was 7 years. That's me every time, says I. But maybe his chance ain't worth no more than that if he'll sell it so cheap. Maybe there's something ain't straight about it. But it is, though, straight as a string. I see the handbill myself. It tells all about him to a dot, paints him like a picture, and tells the plantation he's from below New Orleans. No, sirree, Bob, there ain't no trouble about that speculation, you bet. Say, give me a chaw of tobacco, won't ye? I didn't have one, so he left. I went to the raft and sat down in the wigwam to think, but I couldn't come to nothing. I thought till I wore my head sore, but I couldn't see no way out of the trouble. After all this long journey and after all we've done for them scoundrels, here was it all come to nothing. Everything all busted up and ruined because they could have the heart to serve Jim such a trick as that and make him a slave again all his life and among strangers too for $40 dirty. Once I said to myself, it would be 1,000 times better for Jim to be a slave at home where his family was, as long as he's got to be a slave. So I'd better write a letter to Tom Sawyer and tell him to tell Miss Watson where he was. But I soon give up that notion for two things. She'd be mad and disgusted at his rascality and ungratefulness for leaving her, and so she'd sell him straight down the river again. And if she didn't, everybody naturally despises an ungrateful nigger, and they'd make Jim feel it all the time, and so he'd feel ornery and disgraced. And think of me, it would get all around that Huck Finn helped a nigger to get his freedom, and if I was to ever see anybody from that town again, I'd be ready to get down and lick his boots for shame. That's just the way. A person does a low-down thing, and then he don't want to take no consequences of it. Thinks as long as he can hide it, it ain't no disgrace. That was my fix exactly. The more I studied about this, the more my conscience went to grinding me, and the more wicked and low down and ornery I got to feeling. And at last, when it hit me all of a sudden that here was the plain hand of Providence slapping me in the face and letting me know my wickedness was being watched all the time from up there in heaven, whilst I was stealing a poor old woman's nigger that hadn't ever done me no harm, and now was showing me there's one that's always on the lookout. And ain't a going to allow no such miserable doings to go only just so far and no further. I almost dropped in my tracks. I was so scared. Well, I tried the best I could to kinda soften it up somehow for myself by saying I was brung up wicked, and so I weren't so much to blame. But something inside of me kept saying, there was the Sunday school, you could have gone to it, and if you'd have done it, they'd have learnt you there that people that acts as I'd been acting about that nigger goes to everlasting fire. It made me shiver, and I about made up my mind to pray and see if I couldn't try to quit being the kind of boy I was and be better. So I kneeled down, but the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It weren't no use to try and hide it from him, nor from me neither. I knowed very well why they wouldn't come. It was because my heart weren't right. It was because I weren't square. It was because I was playing double. I was letting on to give up sin, but away inside of me I was holding on to the biggest one of all. I was trying to make my mouth say I would do the right thing and the clean thing and go right to that nigger's owner and tell where he was. But deep down in me I knowed it was a lie, and he knowed it. You can't pray a lie. I found that out. So I was full of trouble, full as I could be. I didn't know what to do. At last I had an idea. I says, I'll go and write the letter and then see if I can pray. Why, it was astonishing the way I felt as light as a feather right straight off and my troubles all gone. So I got a piece of paper and a pencil, all glad and excited, and sat down and wrote, Miss Watson, y'all runaway nigger Jim is down here 2 miles below Pikesville, and Mr. Phelps has got him, and he will give him up for the reward if you send Huck Finn. I felt good and all washed clean of sin for the first time I had ever felt so in my life, and I knowed I could pray now, but I didn't do it straight off, but laid the paper down and sat there thinking how good it was all this happened so, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell. And went on thinking. And got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me all the time in the day and in the night time, sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we are floating along, talking and singing and laughing. But somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him, but only the other kind. I'd see him standing my watch on top of his instead of calling me, so I could go on sleeping, and see him how glad he was when I come back out of the fog, and when I come to him again in the swamp, up there where the feud was, and such like times, and would always call me honey and pet me and do everything he could think for me, and do everything he could think of for me, and how good he always was. And at last I struck the time I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard, and he was so grateful and said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world, and the only one he's got now. And then I happened to look around and see that paper. It was a close place. I took it up. I held it in my hand. I was trembling because I had got to decide forever betwixt two things. And I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they were said, and I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head and said I would take up my wickedness again, which was in my line being brung up to it, and the other warrant. And for a starter, I would go to work and steal Jim out of the slavery again. And if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too, because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog. Then I set to thinking over how to get at it, and turned over considerable many ways in my mind, and at last fixed up a plan that suited me. So then I took the bearings of a woody island that was down the river a piece, and as soon as it was fairly dark, I crept out with my raft and went for it, and hid it there, and then turned in. I slept the night through and got up before it was light, and had my breakfast, and put on my store clothes, and tied up some others and one thing or another in a bundle, and took the canoe and cleared for shore. I landed below where I judged was Phelps' place, and hid my bundle in the woods, and then filled up the canoe with water, loaded with rocks into her, and sunk her where I could find her again when I wanted her, about 1/4 mile below a little steam sawmill that was on the bank. Then I struck up the road, and when I passed the mill I seen a sign on it, Phelps's Sawmill. And when I come to the farmhouses 200 or 300 yards further along, I kept my eyes peeled, but didn't see nobody around, though it was good daylight now. But I didn't mind, because I didn't want to see nobody just yet. I only wanted to get the lay of the land. According to my plan, I was going to turn up there from the village, not from below. So I just took a look and shoved along, straight for the town. Well, the very first man I see when I got there was the Duke. He was sticking up a bill for the Royal Nonsuch, 3-night performance like the other time. They had the cheek, them frauds. I was right on him before I could shriek. He looked astonished and says, "Hello, where'd you come from?" Then he says, kind of glad and eager, "Where's the raft? Got her in a good place?" I says, Why, that's just what I was a-going to ask your grace. Then he didn't look so joyful and says, what was your idea for asking me? He says. Well, I says, when I see the king in that doggery yesterday, I says to myself, we can't get him home for hours till he's soberer. So I went a-loafing around town to put in the time and wait. A man up and offered me 10 cents to help him pull a skiff over the river and back to fetch a sheep. So I went along. But when we was dragging him to the boat, the man left me a hold of the rope and went behind him to shove him along. He was too strong for me and jerked loose and run, and we after him. We didn't have no dog, so we had to chase him all over the country till we tired him out. We never got him till dark. Then we fetched him over, and I started down for the raft. When I got there and see it was gone, I says to myself, they've got into trouble and had to leave, and they took my nigger, which is the only nigger I've got in the world, and now I'm in a strange country and ain't got no property no more, no nothing, and no way to make my living. So I sit down and cried. I slept in the woods all night. But what did become of the raft then? And Jim, poor Jim. Blamed if I know, that is, what's become of the raft. That old fool had made a trade and got $40, and when we found him in the dodgery, the loafers had matched $half with him and got every cent but what he'd spent for whiskey. And when I got him home late last night and found the raft gone, we said, the little rascal has stole our raft and shook us and run off down the river. I wouldn't shake my nigger, would I? The only nigger I had in the world, and the only property. We never thought of that. Fact is, I reckon we'd come to consider him our nigger. Yes, we did consider him so. Goodness knows we had trouble enough for him. So when we see the raft was gone, we flat broke, there weren't anything but to try the Royal Nonsuch another shake. And I've pegged along ever since, dry as a powder horn. Where's that 10 cents? Give it here. I had considerable money, so I give him 10 cents, but begged him to spend it for something to eat and give me some, because it was all the money I had and hadn't had nothing to eat since yesterday. The next minute he whirls on me and says, do you reckon that nigger would blow on us? We'd skin him if he done that. How can he blow? Han't he run off? No, that old fool sold him and never divided with me, and the money's gone. Sold him, I says, and begun to cry. Why, he was my nigger, and that was my money. Where is he? I want my nigger. Well, you can't get your nigger, that's all, so dry up your blubbering. Looky here, do you think you'd venture to blow on us? Blamed if I think I'd trust you. Why, if you want to blow on us. He stopped, but I never see the Duke look so ugly out of his eyes before. I went on a whimper and says, I don't want to blow on nobody, and I ain't got no time to blow no how. I got to turn out and find my nigger. He looked kinda bothered. And stood there with his bills fluttering on his arm, thinking and wrinkling up his forehead. At last he says, I'll tell you something. We got to be here 3 days. If you'll promise you won't blow and won't tell the nigger blow, I'll tell you where to find him. So I promised, and he says, a farmer by the name of Silas Fur. Then he stopped. You see, he started to tell me the truth. But when he stopped that way and begun to study and think again, I reckon he was changing his mind. And so he was. He wouldn't trust me. He wanted to make sure of having me out of the way the whole 3 days. So pretty soon, he says, the man that bought him is named Abram G. Foster. And he lives 40 miles back here in the country on the road to Lafayette. All right, I says. I can walk it in 3 days, and I'll start this very afternoon. No, you won't. You'll start now, and don't lose any time about it neither, nor do any gabbling by the way. Just keep a tight tongue in your head and move right along, and then you won't get into trouble with us, d'ye hear? That was the order I wanted, and that was the one I played for. I wanted to be left free to work my plans. So clear out, he says, and tell Mr. Foster whatever you want to. Maybe you can get him to believe that Jim is your nigger. Some idiots don't require documents, leastways. I've heard there's such down south here. And when you tell him the handbill and the reward bogus, maybe he'll believe you when you explain to him what the idea was for getting him out. Go along now and tell him anything you want to, but mind you, don't work your jaw any between here and there. So I left and struck for the back country. I didn't look around, but I kind of felt like he was watching me. But I knowed I could tire him out that way. But I knowed I could tire him out at that. I went straight out in the country as much as a mile before I stopped. Then I doubled back through the woods toward Phelps. I reckon I better start on my plan straight off without fooling around, because I wanted to stop Jim's mouth till these fellows could get away. I didn't want no trouble with their kind. I'd seen all I wanted to of them and wanted to get entirely shut of them. Chapter 32. When I got there, it was all still and Sunday-like and hot and sunshiny. The hands was gone to the fields, and there was them kind of faint dronings of bugs and flies in the air that makes it seem so lonesome and like everybody's dead and gone. And if a breeze fans along and quivers the leaves, it makes you feel mournful, because you feel like it's spirits, whispering spirits that's been dead ever so many years, and you always think they're talking about you. As a general thing, it makes a body wish he was dead too, and done with it all. Phelps was one of these little one-horse cotton plantations, and they all look alike. A rail fence round a 2-acre yard, a stile made out of logs sawed off and upended, and steps like barrels of a different length to climb over the fence with, and for the women to stand on when they are going to jump into a horse. Some sickly grass patches in the big yard, but mostly it was bare and smooth like an old hat with the nap rubbed off. Big double log house for the white folks, huge logs, with the chinks stopped up with mud or mortar, and these mud stripes been whitewashed some time or another. Round log kitchen with a big broad open but roof passage joining it to the house. Log smokehouse back of the kitchen. 3 little log nigger cabins in a row t'other side the smokehouse. 1 little hut all by itself away down against the back fence, and some outbuildings down a piece the other side. Ash hopper and big kettle to boil soap in by the little hut. Bench by the kitchen door with bucket of water and a gourd. Hound asleep there in the sun. More hounds asleep round about 3 shade trees away off in the corner, and some currant bushes and gooseberry bushes in one place by the fence. Outside of the fence, a garden and a watermelon patch. Then the cotton fields begins, and after the fields, the woods. I went around and clubbed over the back stile by the ash hopper and started for the kitchen. When I got a little ways, I heard the dim hum of a spinning wheel wailing along up and sinking along down again. And then I knowed for certain I wished I was dead, for that is the lonesomest sound in the whole world. I went right along, not fixing up any particular plan, but just trusting the Providence to put the right words in my mouth when the time come. For I'd noticed that Providence always did put the right words in my mouth if I left it alone. When I got halfway, first one hound and then another got up and went for me, and of course I stopped and faced them and kept still, and such another powwow as they made. In a quarter of a mile I was a kind of a hub of a wheel, as you may say, spokes made out of dogs, circle of 15 of them packed together around me with their necks and noses stretched up towards me. Barking and howling, and more a-coming. You could see them sailing over fences and around corners from everywheres. A nigger woman comes tearing out of the kitchen with a rolling pin in her hand, singing out, "Begone, you! Tig, you Spot, be gone, sir. And she fetched first one and then another of them a clip and sent him howling, and then the rest followed. And the second half of them come back, wagging their tails around me and making friends with me. There ain't no harm in the hound, nohow. And behind the woman comes a little nigger girl and two little nigger boys without anything on but two linen shirts. And they hung onto their mother's gown and peeped out from behind her at me, bashful, the way they always do. And here comes the white woman running from the house, about 45 or 50-year-old, bareheaded, and her spinning stick in her hand. And behind her comes her little white children, acting the same way the little niggers was doing. She was smiling all over, so she could hardly stand, and says, "It's you, at last, ain't it?" I'm out with a "Yes'm" before I thought. She grabbed me and hugged me tight, and then gripped me by both hands and shook, and tears come in her eyes and run down over, and she couldn't seem to hug and shake enough, and kept saying, "You don't look as much like your mother as I reckoned you would. But law's sakes, I don't care for that. I'm so glad to see you. Dear, it does seem like I could eat you up. Children, it's your cousin Tom. Tell him howdy." But they ducked their heads and put their fingers in their mouths and hid behind her. So she run on, "Liza, hurry up and get him a hot breakfast right away. Or did you get your breakfast on the boat?" I said I got it on the boat. So then she started for the house, leading me by the hand and the children tagging after. When we got there, she set me down in a split-bottom chair and set herself down on a little low stool in front of me, holding both of my hands, and says, "Now I can have a good look at you. And laws of me, I've been hungry for it a many a time all these long years, and it's come at last. We've been expecting you a couple of days and more. What's kept you? Boat get aground?" "Yes'm, she..." "Don't say yes'm, say Aunt Sally. Where'd she get aground?" I didn't rightly know what to say, because I didn't know whether the boat would be coming up the river or down. But I go a good deal on instinct, and my instinct said she would be coming up from down toward Orleans. That didn't help me much, though, for I didn't know the names of bars down that way. I see I got to invent a bar, or forget the name of the one we got aground on, or now I struck an idea and fetched it out. It weren't the grounding that didn't keep us back, but a little. We blowed out a cylinder head. Oh, gracious. Anybody hurt? "No, killed a nigger." Well, it's lucky, because sometimes people do get hurt. 2 years ago, last Christmas, your Uncle Silas was coming up from New Orleans on the old Lally Rook, and she blowed out a cylinder head and crippled a man, and I think he died afterwards. He was a Baptist. Your Uncle Silas knowed a family in Baton Rouge that knowed his people very well. Yes, I remember. Now he did die. Mortification set in, and they had to amputate him, but it didn't save him. Yes, it was mortification. That was it. He turned blue all over and died in the hope of a glorious resurrection. They say he was a sight to look at. Your uncle's been up to the town every day to fetch you, and he's gone again, not more than an hour ago. He'll be back any minute now. You must have met him on the road, didn't you? Oldish man with a... No, I didn't see nobody, Aunt Sally. The boat landed just at daylight, and I left my baggage on the wharf boat and went looking around the town and out a piece in the country to put in the time and not get here too soon, and so I come down the back way. Who'd you give the baggage to? Nobody. Why, child, it'll be stole. Not where I hid it, I reckon it won't, I says. How'd you get your breakfast so early on the boat? It was kind of thin ice, but I says, The captain seen me standing around and told me I better have something to eat before I went ashore, so he took me into Texas to the officers' lunch and give me all I wanted. I was getting so uneasy I couldn't listen good. I had my mind on the children all the time. I wanted to get them out to one side and pump them a little and find out who I was. But I couldn't get no show. Mrs. Phelps kept it up and run on so. Pretty soon she made the cold chill streak all down my back because she says, "But here we're a-running on this way and you hain't told me a word about Sis, nor any of them. Now I'll rest my works a little and you start up yourn. Just tell me everything. Tell me all about 'em all, every one of 'em, and how they are and what they're doing and what they're told you to tell me, and every last thing you can think of." Well, I see I was up a stump, and up it good. Providence had stood by me this fur, all right, but I was hard and tight aground. Now. I see it warn't a bit of use to try to go ahead. I'd got to throw up my hand. So I says to myself, here's another place where I got to risk the truth. I opened my mouth to begin, but she grabbed me and hustled me in behind the bed and says, "Here he comes. Stick your head down lower there. That'll do. You can't be seen now. Don't you let on you're here. I'll play a joke on him. Children, don't you say a word." I see I was in a fix now, but it weren't no use to worry. There weren't nothing to do but just hold still and try and be ready to stand from under when the lightning struck. I had just one little glimpse of the old gentleman when he come in. Then the bed hit him. Mrs. Phelps, she jumps for him and says, "Has he come?" "No," says her husband. "Goodness gracious," she says, "what in the world can have become of him?" "I can't imagine," says the old gentleman, "and I must say it makes me dreadful uneasy." "Uneasy?" she says. "I'm ready to go distracted. He must have come and you've missed him along the road. I know it's so. Something tells me so." "Why, Sally, I couldn't miss him along the road, you know that. But, oh, dear, what will Sis say? He must have come. You must have missed him. Oh, don't distress me any more, and I'm already distressed. I don't know what in the world to make of it. I'm at my wit's end, and I don't mind acknowledging it. I'm right down scared. But there's no hope that he's come, for he couldn't come and me miss him. Sally, it's terrible, just terrible. Something's happened to the boat, sure." "Why, Silas, look yonder, up the road. Ain't that somebody coming?" He sprung to the window at the head of the bed, and that gave Mrs. Phelps the chance she wanted. She stooped down quick at the foot of the bed and gave me a pull, and out I come. And when he turned back from the window, there she stood, a-beaming and a-smiling like a house fire, and I standing pretty meek and sweaty alongside. The old gentleman stared and says, "Why, who's that? Who do you reckon 'tis?" "I hain't no idea who is it. It's Tom Sawyer." By jings, I most slumped through the floor, but there weren't no time to swap knives. The old man grabbed me by the hand and shook and kept on shaking, and all the time how the woman did dance around and laugh and cry, and then how they both did fire off questions about Sid and Mary and the rest of the tribe. But if they was joyful, I weren't nothing to what I was, for it was like being born again. I was so glad to find out who I was. Well, they froze to me for 2 hours, and at last, when my chin was so tired it couldn't hardly go any more, I had told them more about my family, the Sawyer family, than ever happened to any 6 Sawyer families. And I explained all about how we blowed out a cylinder head at the mouth of White River, and it took us 3 days to fix it, which was all right, and worked first rate, because they didn't know but what it would take 3 days to fix it. If I'd have called it a bolt head, it would have done just as well. Now I was feeling pretty comfortable all down one side and pretty uncomfortable all up the other, being Tom Sawyer was easy and comfortable. And it stayed easy and comfortable till by and by I heard a steamboat coughing along down the river. Then I says to myself, suppose Tom Sawyer come down in that boat. And suppose he steps in here any minute and sings out my name before I can throw him a wink to keep quiet. Well, I couldn't have it that way. It wouldn't do at all. I must go up the road and waylay him. So I told the folks I reckoned I would go up to the town and fetch down my baggage. The old gentleman was for going along with me, but I said no. I could drive the horse myself, and I'd druther he wouldn't take no trouble about me.